all of these, kind of issues that we're tossing around are, I guess, holes and areas of need. Looking at the 49ers depth, like that is now kind of becoming, I think, a little bit of a question here of, okay, they have a lot of top flight players and a lot of them have earned big contracts for themselves. But now it becomes replenishing that depth, which made them such a force. I would say primarily on defense last year and in previous years. They have been able to, kind of I don't want to say find scraps, but find players that they can, with the rest of those stars, turn into valuable and effective players. And I mean, it kind of touched on it. I believe it starts in the draft, but I think it also is a position where the 49ers have so much money tied up in these big boys, and they're going to have even more money tied up in Nick Bosa. That I kind of do question if they are a little too top heavy, so to speak. I don't know if they can fault themselves for that, but I think that that's the way I'm beginning to look at them more as we move on.
They are pretty top heavy. You're right. I mean, you look at some of the cap numbers and the cap hits. I mean, a gigantic percentage. I don't have the numbers in front of me exactly, but a gigantic percentage of the team's cap is dedicated to like 5 or 6 players. Um, Now, I'd rather have that than not have those 5 or 6 players because those players deserve the money that they're making. They are insanely good. I mean, we've talked about it a lot. The Niners have a top 5 player at the worst, in every position, basically, other than quarterback and, maybe safety and potentially cornerback. Like almost everywhere else, they have one of the best players in that position in the entire NFL. And when you have that kind of talent, they're going to make a lot of money, and then you're not going to have a ton of space elsewhere. So the reality is, yes, the Niners are relatively top heavy, but it's something that I said earlier in this episode that we can dive into a little bit more. Um, they have done a good job of identifying who is worth that big money, and they haven't really had an issue letting others walk. And when they have let others walk, Evan, I don't remember many of those guys going out and having fantastic careers, fantastic seasons elsewhere that make Niner fans feel, man, if we just held on to that guy. Of course, there are examples. DeForest Buckner is the first one that comes to mind for me. He hasn't been an all pro with the Colts, but he's still good. And that was a trade for the 49ers, not even a decision not to sign him as a free agent. Of course, it was a decision to not give him the money later on. That was a trade for the 49ers, but still, they have done a relatively good job identifying the guys that deserve that big money. And, while it's been frustrating at times, they have generally made the right decisions on letting certain guys go. So while they are top heavy, it certainly constricts what you're able to do throughout the rest of your offseason. I think the Niners have shown all of us that one, they've planned for this. I mean, they knew that the Deebo Samuel extension was coming. They know that the Nick Bosa extension is coming. They have room for all of those things. And when was the last time a player that was a 49er that they couldn't afford, that they decided to let go, made waves elsewhere? It hasn't really happened all that much.
Yeah, I think the first thing you mentioned is what stands out in my mind, and why I feel okay with this being a top heavy team is the fact that if you look around at the running back position, the wide receiver position, left tackle, defensive line, linebacking core, you could even make a case at the safety spot. You have top 5 guys in the league, certainly in the NFC, at all of those positions. And that is also a byproduct of having a quarterback on a rookie deal
Yep.
or having 2 of them in this case, because you are allowed to spend that money elsewhere. Like Nick Bosa is going to be making quarterback money. Lamar Jackson got non-exclusive tagged for $32.5 million, at least at this point. Nick Bosa is going to be making 30 million plus on his next deal per year. Like he is going to be making that amount of money that could go to a signal caller. So the 49ers right now have, I think, a lot of star power, but it isn't, like you mentioned, it isn't hollow star power.
Mm.
So I think that the 49ers are in a position now where they are okay with handing out these contracts because Well, number one, they've none of them have really turned on their own face. But two, when you're in win now mode, you have to pay. You have to pay premium prices, and you also have to be all right with uh, kind of leaning in to whatever I guess I want to call it, philosophy that you have. And Kyle Shanahan is building it around a young quarterback and building it around a ton of players that can beat you from 5 yards or within the line of scrimmage on offense and beat you at the line of scrimmage on defense. So to me, it comes down to what you believe in as a coaching staff and as an organization, and then leaning all the way in and making those smart choices after, which I think the 49ers have done so far. I am curious to see if there's any regression from some of those big contracts as these guys begin to get a little bit older. Even looking at, George Kittle, looking at Fred Warner, guys that are moving into their later 20s and towards, kind of the ends of these big contracts. And also a guy like Trent Williams, who, of
Yeah.
course, every single year we wonder whether or not he's going to retire or not, but continues to play at a high level. If these guys regress at all, if your stars, if your top five players regress at all, that does highlight the lack of depth on your team. That's the only area I see of potential concern for the 49ers moving forward.
Yeah, that's certainly a worry. I think the other thing is when you have a roster built like this, with all of these stars and with a bunch of your money tied up in five, six, seven players, what it does, Evan, is it really challenges, how you build the back end of your roster. And it means you have to hit on some relatively unknown players, whether it is in the draft. It's, drafting a George Kittle in the fifth round. Now, of course, he's making money now, but when they first drafted him, he was still really good and he was on a rookie contract. It's finding a Brock Purdy in the seventh round. It's, identifying Fred Warner, who quickly became one of the best linebackers in the NFL out of the draft. And then it's like we talked about earlier with some of the guys on the defensive line that left. It's acquiring a Charles Omenihu from the Texans in a transaction that no one even really noticed. And he ended up having really big moments for the 49ers. It's those sorts of things. So having all these stars and this incredible collection of talent is fantastic because you know that you have really great players on your roster, but it makes how you fill out the back end of your roster, and you're talking about the depth, how you find that depth, it makes it that much more difficult because you just don't have as many resources as other teams have. And the Niners, they have to be really good at that. Otherwise, they won't survive an NFL season because they're bound to deal with injuries. Maybe not as bad as it was last year, at least specifically in the quarterback position. You at least hope that, knock on wood. But you're not going to get through an NFL season without dealing with injuries at a handful of places. So this type of roster that the Niners have, it means you have to hit on, the back end of the roster guys that other teams, maybe are filling with better, more well known, a little more expensive players. The Niners don't quite have that luxury. So it really challenges the roster construction at the end, the back end of your roster. And the Niners have proven to be pretty good at that, but they're going to have to do it again.
Yeah, and also one thing that I saw on Twitter, Nick Wagner of ESPN talking about how, sort of the cap plays into this. And the 49ers have a little bit more money than the pre-pandemic and even during the pandemic to
Yeah.
spend on their own guys. But of course, that also means that other teams have a lot more money to spend on your guys and your free agents. So that's a reason why I think we're probably also seeing some guys leaving, but also why the 49ers are able to give money to their own players, to their own stars, and to be able to retain them. And so I do think there is, to your point, sort of a bright future in the sense of if you do hit on those draft picks, the 49ers have shown that they give money properly to those guys. So this year, if one of the 11 picks that's coming up in the draft hits, there's a good chance that that guy is going to be an impactful 49er for a very long time. I don't know if you can say that necessarily about other franchises who haven't shown as much, I guess, financial literacy. I don't know, like like have not been able to, properly dole out those contracts. So, I mean, I feel confident, Mark, that this draft, number one, the 49ers have done a pretty good job, and we'll dig more into this as we move towards the draft, but have done a pretty good job of hitting on those late round guys, but then also identifying who they need to retain. And it doesn't necessarily matter where you were taken in the draft also. Just because you're a first round pick, Javon Kinlaw is probably not going to be a part of the team for very much longer. Just because you are a fifth round pick doesn't mean that you can't get the largest tight end contract in history. Just because you were a third round pick doesn't mean you can't get paid like a top flight linebacker. So the 49ers, I think, also because of the cap jumping, will have hopefully, maybe not this offseason, but in the future, a little more financial flexibility.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, I know that the pandemic was really difficult for the 49ers and really for everyone in the NFL because the expected jump in the cap and the money was expected to go up, and then suddenly it just took a dive and everyone had to adjust and figure things out on the fly. But now everything's recovered and the cap is going up again. So the Niners, along with everyone else in the NFL, got through that kind of rough period, and now I think the plan, has resumed. And I mean, this has been a long-term thing for the 49ers. The second that they drafted Nick Bosa, they were planning and hoping that he deserved the gigantic extension that he's likely to get later on this offseason. So it's been years in the making, this offseason has. It's not like this crazy do or die. If they don't hit everything, they're going to be terrible offseason. But this is a plan that has been years in the making. Um, so the idea that they're figuring this out as they're going, and I'm not saying that you're implying that at all, but it's just sometimes the idea that we get as fans, like, oh, what are they doing this offseason? They're letting all this talent. Like, this has been well thought out for years, like literal years. This has been on their board, figuring out how the 2023 offseason was going to go. And they haven't given me much of a reason to think that they're going to screw things up in a major way. Until they prove me wrong there, I think I'll have some faith in that there. But you're right. I mean, this is a big offseason, and they're going to need to hit in a few places where maybe you weren't expecting some hits.
Well, we move closer to a literal year of the 415ers, of course, as we
Hey,
started last season. So, hey, coming up on 365 days, not too far away, Mark. It's been a lot of fun in our first off season doing this podcast on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. That'll wrap it up for this episode. We appreciate you tuning in as always 2 times a week in the off season, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday. We appreciate you. Hope that the Niners are able to make some moves in the meantime, and we'll certainly keep an eye out, as we hope you do too, for the next episode. Appreciate you. We'll talk to you next time.